Welcome to the Contreras Report, International Edition. I'm Raul Lowry Contreras. As it happens, this edition wraps up the year 2020 for us and for you. I'll be discussing all kinds of events, but most of them have occurred in these last few days. It's amazing what is going on between now and January 20th when Joe Biden gets sworn in as president. As many of you know, I am now entering my 33rd year of writing my weekly newspaper column that over the years became an internet column as well as some newspapers. It's published throughout the United States and Mexico and has been picked up and published in Israel, or Jordan, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. That's because I have a great interest in that part of the world and have been there a number of times. From my column's inception of Hispanic views on issues in the United States, social and political, my weekly columns grew in content to foreign affairs of the United States and relations of countries between them if those relations affected Americans and, as it happens, Mexicans. We are next-door neighbors. We are intertwined. Here, for example, is my latest newspaper/internet column. It involves foreign relations, espionage, and the recent pardons by President Trump of people some call traitors. Spies Live Forever by Raul Lowry Contreras. George Blake, a 98-year-old Englishman, died the other day. So did another Englishman, David Cornwell, John le Carre, who died at 89. George Blake was a real spy, a double agent long on the payroll of Britain's Secret Service, MI6, and also on the payroll of the Soviet Union's KGB. John le Carre was an author who wrote brilliantly about men like Blake in dozens of books. Like a le Carre super spy or a relentless spy chaser like George Smiley, Blake was larger than life. After being uncovered as a spy, he was secretly sentenced to a maximum security British prison in London. Like a le Carre hero, 6 years into his 42-year-long sentence, Blake manufactured a ladder out of knitting needles and rope and climbed over the prison wall into London itself. His communist masters emulated a le Carre-like plot. They smuggled him out of Great Britain and into communist East Germany in a camper van's secret compartment. The British report that Blake was perhaps the most effective spy ever, more effective than the British Fab Four of Anthony Blunt, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, and Kim Philby. Blake himself admitted he passed over 4,000 top-secret documents to the Soviets in almost 10 years of espionage. A former head of British intelligence, Dick White, said, Blake exposed scores of British and American spies throughout the Soviet Union and its satellites. They were all killed. Blake, according to White, caused more damage than any other spy in British history. The British Fab Four were recruited as students by communists in the faculty at Cambridge University. Blake, however, converted himself as an adult, perhaps during the 30 months he spent as a civilian prisoner of war in Korea after capture by North Korean communists in 1950. He was, I think, the ultimate Manchurian candidate. If you don't know what that is, Google Manchurian candidate. My theory is he most likely was brainwashed by the communist brainwashing apparatus that not only turned him into a communist, but managed to convince 21 American prisoners of war to reject repatriation when a ceasefire ended Korean War combat in 1953. Blake's death ends the massive treason of British turncoats orchestrated by the Soviet Union from the 1930s to the 1960s. Now, however, we face an American version of the British experience that ended with Blake's death. We have the imprisoned naval Walker family, the CIA's Aldrich Ames, and the FBI's Earl Edwin Pitt and Robert Philip Hansen. In a British jail, we have a Julian Assange, and in a comfortable Moscow apartment, American Edward Snowden. Australian-born Assange is fighting extradition to the United States. He faces charges of conspiracy and espionage with possible sentences totaling 175 years. Assange's WikiLeaks published stolen information that the U.S. claims compromised the national defense. Assange has taken credit also for paying some of Edward Snowden's expenses when, after he skipped out of his government work in Hawaii, he hid in Hong Kong while exploring asylum in Hong Kong and Russia. Assange had a ruling in his favor in a British court that he wasn't to be extradited to the United States. Snowden, a former contractor of the NSA, the National Security Agency, and a former employee of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, fled the United States after he stole hundreds of thousands of NSA files the U.S. government says were secret. Australia says he stole 15,000 or more of its secret files. Great Britain says he stole more than 58,000 of their documents, and the United States says he stole anywhere from 50,000 to 1.5 million secret documents. There are reports that some of his disclosed documents, quote, aided the enemy, unquote, by allowing Middle Eastern terrorists to study methods used by the NSA to track terrorists. Then they used that information to refine their methods of communication to avoid detection. The result, innocent people died. Intelligence analysts easily connect dots between publication of Snowden's stolen documents and dead Americans in the Middle East. I can guarantee that. The U.S. has charged Snowden under the 100-year-old 1917 Espionage Act with, quote, unauthorized communication of national defense information, unquote, and, quote, willful communication of classified communications intelligence information to an unauthorized person, unquote. Snowden, his wife, and newborn child live in an apartment in Moscow supplied by the Russian government. In that, he repeats the exact experience of the British Fab Four traitors and of super spy George Blake. The Russians put them up in comfortable Moscow apartments until they die. In view of the 100 or more pardons being granted by outgoing President Donald Trump to dozens of admitted and or convicted criminals like Sheriff Joe Arpaio, campaign manager Paul Manafort, friend Roger Stone, liar to the FBI Michael Flynn, and others who skirted treason by lying about their activities with Russians during and after the 2016 presidential election, rumors are flying in Washington that President Donald J. Trump will grant a pardon to self-proclaimed, quote, whistleblower, unquote, Edward Snowden. Like Blake and the British Fab Four, Russia now honors Snowden as a legal resident. So will Trump honor American Edward Snowden, traitor, with a pardon? As ridiculous as it sounds, President Trump has passed Richard Nixon in granting pardons to people who make the pardon look like a cheap reward for protecting the president. Example, Roger Stone, liar and conspirator with President Trump while working as a middleman between the Trump campaign and Julian Assange's WikiLeaks, that published a stolen treasure trove of damaging information from the Democratic Party just before the election. Example, convictions of a number of men who were caught up in the Department of Justice's special counsel investigation by former FBI Director Robert Mueller. Trump pardoned those convicted men who had one thing in common. They all protected Trump from any direct involvement. They also kept silent about any activities of Donald Trump Jr., who the investigation proved conclusively that he dealt directly with Russian offers to help Trump's run for the presidency. That's illegal. President Nixon knew that if he pardoned Watergate conspirators, he would be known by history as a totally 1,000% corrupt president, perhaps the worst ever in U.S. history. So Nixon, smart as he was, didn't pardon his own attorney general, his chief of staff, and myriad others swept up by the Watergate burglary and the cover-up of the Watergate crime by the White House and a number of Nixon's staffers and associates. There are still 2 weeks before President Trump loses the ability to grant pardons for federal crimes. What we have no idea about is what soon-to-be former President Trump will do before he leaves office. We do, however, remember what President Clinton did on his very last day in office. He pardoned a treasonous criminal fugitive named Mark Rich, who illegally worked with the Iranian government in actively working against U.S. law. And in so doing, because national security was involved, he was a traitor. That pardon was the first in U.S. history of a fugitive from U.S. justice. There were warrants out for his arrest. As a president need not tell America why he pardons anyone, Clinton has never told us why he pardoned Mark Rich, now dead. Was it for a $400,000 contribution to his 1996 re-election campaign? Or was the attractive Mrs. Mark Rich entertaining President Clinton in a manner he personally enjoyed in the White House previously with a 21-year-old woman, a White House intern? One last note on presidential pardons. President Trump pardoned 4 convicted murderers who were paid with U.S. tax dollars for working as mercenaries in Iraq for an American company of mercenaries. The owner of that company is a friend of Donald Trump's. The 4 slaughtered over a dozen Iraqi men, women, and children, civilians, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. They were convicted and sentenced to terms in prison ranging to life without parole. President Trump pardoned these 4 men. Why, Mr. President? Why? Let's move on to the hottest international rumor being tossed around by those in the world who do not care much for the United States of America. Some years ago, I was attending a week-long seminar at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. One of the subjects covered by seminar participants was the rising economic power of China. Over lunch one day, one of the participants offhandedly stated that China would overcome America's place as the largest economy in the world in just 10 years from that day in 2007. Well, that obviously didn't happen. It's 2021, and now some are saying that China will be the #1 economy in the world in 2030. It's true that the U.S. economy has been devastated by COVID-19, which of course started in China. A huge loss in domestic product and ensuing unemployment and fall of production and of 300,000 dead Americans, maybe even more in the coming year. Any of those things, or all of those things, would kill any other country, but not the U.S. The massive wave of vaccinations for hundreds of millions of Americans that started this last week cast doubt on predictions that China will be the #1 economy ever. The world's largest economy is not going to be China. It's going to be North America. The North American Union will be biggest and best by almost any measure, so writes an American named Carlisle Johnson who lives in Guatemala. He writes in Mexico News Daily this, and I agree with him. Quote, "It's year-end again, and so the nattering nabobs of negativism in the press And the practitioners of the dismal science on economics faculties are looking back to pick past winners and forward to select future winners. Since only the feeble-minded or vaccine makers could label 2020 a good year, they're concentrating almost exclusively on the future. China will be the world's largest economy, they say. By 2026, touts one. By 2050, touts another. Wrong and wrong, he says. By 2050, and maybe even by 2030, it will be Mexico and Canada joining Canada and the United States in a newly recognized North American Union, informal as it might be, as the biggest and most importantly, the best economy by almost any measure, even the snowflakey Green Deal. Let's talk best first, since only bimbos and sumo wrestlers think biggest is best. World GDP, gross domestic product rankings per capita, per individual, excluding the accidentally oil-rich sheikdoms, place the U.S. and Canada at or near the top of the world rankings. China slinks in as number 79. Even Mexico outperforms China by 2-1 in per capita GDP in this key measure. So much for best. Biggest? China's GDP is estimated at US $14.8 trillion. That of the US is estimated at $20.8 trillion. Forgetting for a moment that China's leaders say they don't trust their own numbers, even late ballot counters couldn't close an almost 50% gap by 2030. So let's focus on 2050. The cornerstones of the forthcoming North American Union have been mortared into the new USMCA trade agreement. Adding Mexico's GDP of another $1 trillion plus and Canada's $1.6 trillion to the US total makes catch-up a losing chase for any contender, whether China or the splintering EU, European Union. So forget China by 2030. But by 2050, the sky's the limit. Imagine a single economic entity tied together by roads and trains from Thunder Bay in Canada to Tapachula, the southern end of Mexico. Imagine the world's leaders in old economy fossil fuels. That's Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Imagine limitless sunshine, parentheses, sorry Canada, but you do have hydro, close parentheses, for the new economy based on region renewables. Imagine a manufacturing sector matching abundant Mexican labor with capital-rich Canada and the US. Now, dine on the canard of the world's biggest economy. That was at lunch in 2007. Mr. Carnell, I couldn't say it better than you, than what and how you said it. That is why I so challenged Donald Trump when he claimed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, between the US, Canada, and Mexico was the worst trade agreement in history. That was dumb. It was stupid. It was a stupid statement to make. The fact is backed up by the new trade agreement the Trump administration negotiated with Mexico and Canada that simply added a few small provisions to the old NAFTA and made it NAFTA 2.0. Yes, they called it the US-Mexican-Canadian Agreement, USMCA. If, Mr. Trump, NAFTA was so bad, why did you simply copy it and add a handful of new sentences? The agreement binds the US, Canada, and Mexico into the world's leading producer of energy. There is nothing on the horizon that threatens that number one status. As long as this quote-unquote union, unorganized organization, leads the world in energy production and production per employee, we will be number one. So here we are at the end of 2020 and at the beginning of 2021. 3,000 Americans are dying every day from COVID-19 and its effects. Millions of people who were working a year ago are unemployed and standing for hours in food lines because they can't feed their families. That is the America Donald Trump leaves us with as he skulks out of the White House after being beaten like a drum by, of all people, the lifelong presidential candidate Joe Biden from Delaware. Trump refuses to admit he lost. He lies that he won in a landslide. He lies that the vote was stolen. He lies that he won until absentee votes were counted on November 3rd and into several days in places like California that counted votes that arrived by November 20th. As Trump leaves office, he is pardoning criminals, murderers, thieves, and con men who protected him from legal proceedings, but they are standing by to be launched the second he is no longer president. So that is how Americans leave what may be the worst year in modern American history, the worst since 1918 and the Spanish flu. Internationally, American friends in Europe and Mexico have been brutalized by the COVID-19 pandemic, killing hundreds of thousands of people and causing huge economic damage that some people are suggesting it might take 5 or more years for those countries and the U.S. to bring their economies back to where they were a year ago today. American enemies have also been hit hard by the pandemic, but that hasn't stopped them from pursuing anti-American plans designed to make America less effective in ordinary, everyday activities like trade and help to countries that need to elevate their populations out of poverty and lack of education. China, for example, is active in the Middle East, Africa, and South America, spreading Chinese aid and trade wherever it can and wherever the U.S. isn't as active as it could or should be. Remember, Trump has pulled us back internationally. In Asia itself, China has constructed artificial islands in the South China Sea through which passes 30 to 40% of the world's trade. Why the new islands? So China can claim the entire South China Sea as national Chinese territory that controls traffic through it by other nations. That would choke international trade that we depend on. We depend on other countries being prosperous because of trade. That would choke off, for example, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, economic giants on the world scene, and countries that actually compete with China. Those 3 countries are allied with the U.S. Hurting them or damaging them hurts the U.S. It pleases me that the Trump administration sent the United States naval ship, the USS John McCain, through the South China Sea the other day without asking China for permission that it is demanding of other countries. We must never ask China for anything. Iran continues to threaten the U.S. interests, even as the U.S. hits Iran with more sanctions and killed the #1 Iranian terrorist a year ago. The U.S. intelligence community warns that Iran will strike back one of these days. Iran will strike back, that is guaranteed. Then there is Russia. Russia's best friend, Donald Trump, has been he has been ejected from the White House by a landslide on November 3rd. Nonetheless, Russian adventures will continue. They may be worse for nothing. And new President Joe Biden convinces me that he will be tough on any country that has interests counter to ours. Welcome to 2021. Thank you for being there. Wherever you see the Contreras Report, International Edition, Political Report, or whatever, subscribe to the report. So that way, if you do, you'll be notified when new editions are posted. Subscribe for notifications. Again, thank you so much for being there, and I look forward to being with you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye and adios.
Bye.